Good day, class. I remain your regular biology teacher, Mr. Daniel Equipment. Today we want to look at relevance of biology to agriculture. We all know in our elementary agriculture that agriculture is simply a process where crops are grown, animals are raised for man's consumption. While biology, on the other hand, is the study of plants and animals. Now, how relevant is biology now to agriculture? Knowing too well that these two subjects are science inclined and they have some affiliation. So now we cannot treat agric without considering biology because they come interchangeably. Now, for the sake of these studies, we want to look at agriculture as being grouped into plants and animals. But before we move further, let's look at classification of plants. Plants in this aspect, you are not going to look at the taxonomy as we did in first term. Here we want to look at, in terms of biology, plant is classified into three major parts. The first one we are going to consider is botanical classification. Thereafter, we'll look at agricultural classification. Then finally, we'll consider classification based on life cycle. Now, these are the three categories we are going to classify plants in biology. Now, when we talk of botanical classifications, I want to take your mind back to the first term work, where we had the kingdom Plantae. I hope you still remember this kingdom Plantae. Kingdom Plantae is made up of various taxonomies, starting from schizogony, or what we call the schistophyta. Then we have the telophyta. After the telophyta, we have the bryophyta. Then we have the pteridophyta. Then we have finally as the spermatophyta. Now this is the botanical classification of plants. Don't forget that the schizophyta are mostly microscopic plants. These are these are plants you cannot see with your naked eyes except use of microscope. So they are the schizophyta. Example of this, we can have our Spirogyra. Spirogyra is a plant because it possesses the chlorophyll, and with the help of the chlorophyll, it can manufacture its food on its own. Now we have the next group called the telophyta. The telophyta are mostly the algae, and these algae are divided into three types. We have the rhodophyta. The rhodophyta are mainly the green algae. The red algae. Then we have the chlorophyta. As the name implies, chloro, that tells you that they are the green algae. Then finally, we have the phagophyta. The phagophyta. This incidentally makes up the brown algae. So you can see that the schizophyta are the microscopic plants. We have the telophyta that makes up the algae. Then we have the bryophyta. Bryophyta are not microscopic because you can see them. They are mainly multicellular organisms. An example of this is our mosses that grows on moist environment, mostly on dilapidated buildings and fence. Then we have the pteridophyta. The pteridophyta are mostly plants that gain support by growing on other plants. Example, we have the fern. You can easily see them grow on a palm tree. Those are the pteridophyta. And from here you see that they have started possessing leaves and roots. Then finally we come to the spermatophyta. The spermatophyta is grouped into two. This is where we have the plant with seed, what we call the seed plant. We have the gymnosperm, or we call them gymnosperms. And finally we have the angiosperms. The gymnosperms are mostly plants that does not produce flowers. They don't produce flowers, while the angiosperms are flowering plants. So because the angiosperms are flowering plants, they are divided into two, where we have the monocotyledon and the dicotyledon. Let me quickly take the botanical classification again. I told you that botanical classification has its origin from the kingdom Plantae. The kingdom Plantae divides plants into 5 divisions. We have the schizophyta. I told you the schizophyta are mostly unicellular plants, mostly aquatic in nature. While we have the telophyta are mostly the algae. And algae are divided into 3. We have the rhizophyta. The rhizophyta are mostly the red algae. Then we have the chlorophyta. From the name chloro, we are looking at green. So they make up the green algae. You have the phacocyta, which are the brown algae. Other classifications include the bryophyta. I've given you an example to be the mosses. Then we have the pteridophyta, which is the fern. I told you that ferns are plants that has leaves, but they cannot grow on their own. So as a result of that, they get their support from trees like palm tree. You see them growing along on the body of the palm tree. Then after the pteridophyta, we now have the true plants, which make up the spermatophyta. Spermatophyta is divided into 2 groups. We have the gymnosperms, which are the plants that does not produce flowers. They are plants that they don't produce flowers. Then we have the angiosperm, which are plants that produces flower. And these plants with flower are further divided into 2. We have the monocotyledon and the dicotyledon. Example of a monocotyledonous plant can be the maize. While a dicot mostly are the cowpeas. And you know cowpeas are where beans originate from. Now let's go to classification based on agriculture. For example, agricultural classification. The first one on my list are the cereals, the cereal plants. So plants are classified based on cereals. An example, we have the maize, we have rice, etc. You can read up the rest for yourself. We have legumes, they are classified as legumes, legume plants. An example of legume plants are the cowpea, where we have the beans, we have the groundnuts, etc. Agri-classification again, they can classify plants based on roots. Some plants are root crops and some are tubers. So roots and tuber plants, can you think of one? Let me give you an example. We have things like cassava, we have yam, because we are talking about tubers, etc. Agri equally classify them based on vegetables. Based on vegetables. So we call them vegetable crops. And examples of vegetable crops include onions, we have okra, etc. The fifth classification based on agriculture is what we call the fruits. The fruit plants. Example of fruit plants, we can mention that we have pawpaw and the rest of the fruits you can think of, etc. We have the sixth classification. Agricultural classification can be based on beverage. Beverage plants. Examples of beverage plants are, we have a cocoa and others can come in, coffee and the rest of it. Let's go to another classification. We have spices. You may call them spices, plants or crops. Examples of spices, we have ginger, we have pepper. Those are spices and there are more. Another classification is oil plants. Agri can classify plants based on oil. So they call it oil plants. An example, if you think of your palm, or let's say oil palm, to be on a correct mode, oil palm. These are plants that when you squeeze, you bring out oil. Number 9, we have fiber. Fiber plants. These are plants that can be used to produce clothing. Examples of such plants are the cottons. Finally, based on agricultural classification, we have latex. Latex plants. Now, examples of latex plants or crops are rubber. You can see that when you have rubber, the end product of that rubber can produce a lot of materials like plastics. So let me run through agricultural classification once again. I said classification based on agriculture can be grouped into 10 categories. The first one is cereals. Here we have the maize, the rice, and so on and so forth. We have the legumes. We have roots and tuber plants. We have vegetable crops, fruit crops, beverage, spices, oil plants, fibers, and latex. So Agric has grouped all the plants and categorized them in this form. Don't forget we started with the botanical, where I told you the schistosophylla, then we have the pteridophyta, bryophyta, spermatophyta, and the rest. So finally, let us look at classification based on life cycle. Live before they finally die, because we are looking at living things. Everything that has life has an expiration. That is one of the characteristics of living things. So because of this, agriculture had to classify plants based on their life cycles in 3 categories. The first one we will consider is annual. So annual here means 1 season. That is plants that can be grown just in a year, 1 season. An example of such plants could be the maize. Maize can only grow for 1 year, including rice, and there are others. Number 2, plants can be classified based on biennial. This simply means they can be grown within 2 years. Within 2 years. An example of such, we have carrots, we have onions. Then finally, we have perennial. These are crops that grows above 2 years. Mostly the trees. So example, we have cocoa, we have banana, plantain, etc. So I want you to go through these notes, ask questions where necessary, look at the classification again, based on botanical classification, look at based on agricultural classification, and consider based on life cycle. See how it is numbered. Wherever you have any problems, you can always get back to me through our website. Thank you very much.